Before Urena and Urema were born, the sky spoke. It happened on the night of the great eclipse, the kind that comes once in a generation, when the moon swallows the sun whole and the world is plunged into a darkness so complete that even the birds stop singing. In the kingdom of Adumare, a land of red earth and ancient rivers, where the Iroko trees grew so tall they scraped the belly of the heavens, such a night was never a good omen. The eldest oracle, Mama Chidinma, a woman so old that even the oldest men in the palace could not remember a time before her, sat up from her sleeping mat at the exact moment the eclipse began. She had not been awake. She had not been dreaming. Something had simply pulled her upright, the way a mother is pulled from sleep by a child's cry before the child has even cried. She walked out of her hut barefoot into the black night, lifted her face to the sky, and was silent for a long time. Then she said, to no one in particular, "The gods are sending something they have never sent before." Inside the palace, Queen Adisi screamed. Her labor had begun. The royal midwives had attended many births in the palace of Adumare. They had delivered children in the rain, in the dry season, in times of war and times of plenty. They were women who did not frighten easily. But when the twin girls emerged, one after the other, separated by only 3 breaths, the eldest midwife, Mama Nkechi, went completely still. In all her years, she had never seen twins born without the membrane. Every twin birth she had attended, yet the 2 children were separated inside the womb by a thin wall, nature's way of giving each child their own space, their own beginning, their own self. These 2 had no such wall. They had shared everything, every fluid, every heartbeat, every breath the womb had ever taken. They had lived for 9 months, pressed against each other, skin to skin, with nothing between them, not even the thinnest layer of separation. "Na'em," Mama Nkechi whispered, stepping back. "My father." An expression of shock so profound that language nearly failed her. The babies were not crying. Every child she had ever delivered cried at birth. That sharp, furious wail that announces the arrival of a new soul into a world of air and cold and light. These 2 were silent. They lay in the midwife's hands, their eyes closed, their tiny faces serene. And they were holding hands, not by accident, not by the casual proximity of 2 newborns placed together. Their fingers were interlocked, the right hand of one clasped inside the left hand of the other, as though they had been holding on since the very beginning and had no intention of stopping now. Mama Nkechi placed them on the warm cloth prepared for them and waited. The silence stretched. Then, slowly, as though she had simply been deciding whether to bother, the first twin opened her mouth and cried, a single, clear, bell-like sound. The second twin answered immediately, the same pitch, the same duration, as though the first had asked a question and the second had given an answer. Then they were both quiet again, their hands still clasped, their breathing perfectly matched. Rise and fall, rise and fall. 2 chests moving as one. Queen Adisi, exhausted and trembling, lifted her head from the birthing mat. "Let me see them," she said. When they placed the babies in her arms, both of them together, because separating them even then felt wrong, felt like an act of violence against some natural law, Adisi looked at their faces and began to weep. Not from grief, from something she could not name. A feeling like standing at the edge of something enormous, something ancient, something that had been decided long before she was born and would continue long after she was gone. "Urena," she said, touching the face of the firstborn, "beauty that cannot be contained." "Urema," she said, touching the face of the second, beauty that flows like water. Outside, as if in response, the eclipse ended. The sun returned. And in the kingdom of Adumare, a people stepped out of their homes and looked at the sky and felt, without knowing why, that something had changed forever. Mama Chidinma, still standing in the compound, turned toward the palace and nodded slowly. "They have arrived," she said. They learned to walk on the same day, not because they were shown together or because one copied the other, but because they simply could not learn to walk alone. When the palace women tried to stand Urena on her feet without Urema beside her, her legs refused to hold her weight. Her body knew something was missing. The moment Urema was brought to stand beside her, Urena straightened, took one wobbling step, and fell directly into her sister, who caught her instinctively before she had even finished falling. The palace women laughed and exchanged glances that slowly, over the months and years, unshifted from amusement to wonder to something quieter, something like reverence. They spoke their first words to each other, not to any adult. They were 10 months old when Urena turned to Urema in their shared sleeping cradle and said, clearly and distinctly, "Ni, mother." Urema replied immediately, "Ni." And then they looked at each other and seemed satisfied, as though they had confirmed something important. By the time they were 3, the whole palace understood certain things about the princesses of Adumare. Urena could not eat unless Urema ate first. It was not a preference or a habit, it was a physical reality. If food was placed before Urena without Urema being fed, her throat would close. She would sit before a feast, hungry enough to cry, and be unable to swallow a single grain. The moment Urema took her first bite, Urena's throat would relax, and she would eat. The royal physicians examined her repeatedly and found no illness, no deformity, no explanation. Eventually, they stopped looking for one. When Urema was hurt, a scraped knee from the courtyard, a finger burned on a cooking stone, Urena would cry before she heard her sister make a sound. Once, when Urema fell from a low wall in the inner garden, Urena, who was in a completely different part of the palace with her reading tutor, stopped speaking mid-lesson and began to sob. When they brought Urema to her, bleeding from a cut above her brow, Urena pressed her own forehead against the wound, as though she could take the injury into herself. They dreamed the same dream every night. This was the thing that frightened the palace women most. Each morning, and the twins would sit together at breakfast and finish each other's description of the night's dream. One starting the sentence, the other completing it, neither of them finding this unusual. The dream was always the same. 2 stars, side by side, moving through a sky so vast it had no edges, never separating, never dimming. They were 5 years old when they were first deliberately separated. King Odinaka, their father, a tall, quiet man whose gentleness was mistaken by neighboring kingdoms for weakness until they encountered him in council, had listened patiently to his advisers for months. Ogbuefi Ezi, the eldest council elder, had finally placed the matter plainly on the table. "My king, these children cannot remain this way. A princess of Adumare must be able to stand alone. She must be able to speak alone, eat alone, sleep alone. What happens when they are grown and must be married? What happens when one must travel, must represent the kingdom in a distant court, must sit in judgment without her sister beside her? You are raising girls who will be useless to this kingdom." King Odinaka had been silent for a long time. "Separate them for one afternoon," Ogbuefi Ezi pressed. "Let them learn. Children adapt." The king agreed. It was the only decision of his reign he would regret until his death. They put Urena in the east wing and Urema in the west wing. with palace women stationed at every corridor to ensure they could not find each other. At first, both girls were simply confused, then anxious. Then, within the hour, something happened that no one who witnessed it ever entirely recovered from. Urena's heartbeat became irregular. The royal physician, unsummoned in alarm, pressed his ear to her chest and heard a rhythm that made no medical sense. A heartbeat searching for something, stuttering, incomplete. Urema, on the other side of the palace, had gone completely silent and sat on her mat with her eyes wide open, staring at nothing, as though she were looking at something in a place no one else could see. When they brought the girls back together, they did not run to each other dramatically. They simply walked to each other with the calm certainty of water finding its level, sat down side by side, and the moment their arms touched, Urena's heartbeat returned to normal. Urema blinked and looked around the room and reached up to wipe a tear from her sister's face that Urena herself had not noticed she was crying. Ogbuefi never suggested separation again, but by the time Urena and Urema were young women, tall and identical, with their mother's wide forehead and their father's still, watchful eyes, the kingdom of Adumare had organized its understanding of them into something between myth and fact. The people knew, when the twin princesses walked through the market together, the market thrived. Traders reported their best sales on those days. Mothers brought sick children to stand near them, not for any ritual reason, but out of an instinct that the presence of such unity might carry its own medicine. They moved through the palace and the kingdom like a piece of music, one the melody, one the harmony, so perfectly matched that you could not imagine either sound existing without the other. Urena was quicker to speak, quicker to laugh, yet the one whose emotion showed on her face before she had decided to show it. Urema was the depth beneath the brightness, the one who listened until she understood everything, who spoke rarely but landed every word precisely where it needed to land. Visitors to the palace watched them and went home troubled by a feeling they struggled to name. Dignitaries from distant kingdoms, ambassadors from courts far richer and more powerful than Adumare, would sit through a formal audience and spend half of it simply watching the twin princesses. The way Urena would lean slightly toward Urema before answering a question. The way Urema would begin pouring water for both of them before Urena had said she was thirsty. The way their laughter arrived in waves, one completing what the other started. And a visiting queen from the northern kingdom of Newi was said to have wept on her journey home. When her attendant asked why, she looked out at the road ahead and said simply, "I have never been loved like that, not by anyone." Palace guards, who had been posted to the twins' corridor for years, began to find their own marriages strange and insufficient by comparison. Not because they wanted what the princesses had, but because seeing it every day made them realize they had not known, before this, what love in its fullest form looked like. They had thought they knew. They had been wrong. The twins were not performing for anyone. That was the thing. There was nothing deliberate in the way they loved each other. It was not tenderness displayed for the court or affection arranged for an audience. It was simply what they were. And the same way a river does not perform the act of flowing, it flows because it has no other nature. Urena braided Urema's hair every morning without being asked, her fingers moving through the thick dark coils with the practiced ease of someone doing something they have always done and will always do. Urema tasted every dish before it reached Urena's mouth, not as a servant performs a duty, but as a body checks that the air is safe before the lungs draw it in. When Urema read, she read aloud, because Urena's mind wandered without the anchor of a voice. When Urena danced at the festival gatherings, and she danced the way her father smiled. No, rarely but completely, Urema stood at the edge of the space and watched with an expression that the palace women quietly described to each other as the face of someone watching the most beautiful thing in the world. They were, the people of Adumare agreed, what the gods looked like when the gods were tender. In the dry season of the twins' 21st year, King Odinaka collapsed in the council hall. It was not sudden in truth. Those who had watched him closely had seen the signs. The slight drag in his step, the way he held the arm of his chair when rising, the pauses in his speech that were not thoughtfulness but the effort of concealing pain. But the king was a man who believed that a ruler's weakness was a weapon given freely to one's enemies, and so he had hidden it, and the hiding had cost him time he could not recover. The royal physicians said, "His heart is tired." They said, "He has perhaps one dry season remaining, perhaps two if he rests completely and troubles himself with nothing." They said many careful hedge things that all meant the same thing, which was, prepare. The kingdom heard, the way kingdoms always hear things that are not announced, through the lowered voices of servants, through the too careful expressions of council elders in the market, through the particular silence that falls over a palace when its center is no longer certain. And the council convened. Ogbuefi Eze was older now, his hair completely white, his walk slower, but his politics were unchanged, sharpened, if anything, by age. He sat at the head of the council table and spoke in the measured tones of a man who believes he is being reasonable. The law of Adumare is clear. The throne passes to one heir, one voice, one crown, one authority. This is not my invention. It is older than this palace, older than the founding of this kingdom. The gods themselves decreed it. The council listened. The Princess Urena, as firstborn, is the natural heir. She will be crowned at the appropriate time. The Princess Urema, and here he paused and arranged his face into something sympathetic that reached nowhere near his eyes, will be given in marriage to the kingdom of Enugu-Eze. Their crown prince has already expressed interest. It would be a powerful alliance. The kingdom would benefit greatly. Silence in the council hall. Then one voice, younger, near the back. And if they cannot be separated? Ogbuefi Eze did not look at the speaker. They will learn. They are young women, not children. What was indulged in childhood cannot be permitted to govern a kingdom. Word reached the princesses before the sun had moved a hand's width across the sky. Urena heard it and said nothing. She went to the window of their shared chamber and stood looking out at the courtyard below. The Iroko tree that had been there since before their grandfather's time, the women grinding pepper near the south wall, the ordinary afternoon activity of a palace that did not yet know it was about to be asked to break something that could not be broken without consequence. Urema came and stood beside her. Their arms touched. They stood in silence for a long time. "I will not go," Urema said finally, not dramatically, not with tears, the way a person states something they know to be simply and absolutely true. "I know," Urena said. They stood at the window until the sun moved, and the light changed, and the courtyard below went from gold to shadow. The elders believed they could be firm. They had managed kings. They had managed wars and famines and succession crises that tore other kingdoms apart. They were confident in their ability to manage two young women, however unusual. They were not prepared for the land. The morning after the council's decision was delivered formally to the princesses, the river that fed the western farms ran low, not dramatically, just noticeably. The farmers who drew from it each morning looked at the reduced current and frowned and said nothing, because one low morning did not make a crisis. The second morning, lower still. The third morning, the women who kept the twin princesses' household reported that Urena had not eaten in 2 days. Her throat had not closed this time. It was not a physical obstruction. She simply sat before her meals and could not bring herself to eat. And Urema, watching her, found she had no appetite either. They sat across from each other at the meal table like two people keeping vigil. On the fourth day, after the council's decision, the sky, which in the dry season should have been clear and hard and bright, gathered clouds that had no business being there. Low, heavy, grey clouds that sat over the kingdom of Adumare and did not release rain, did not move on, just sat there, pressing down, like a sky that was waiting. The farmers spoke to the priests. The priests went to Mama Chidinma. The old oracle sat with her eyes closed for a long time. Then she said, what in a voice that had not aged since the night of the eclipse 21 years ago, the land and the twins are the same. What you do to one, you do to the other. What you threaten in the palace, the river feels. The gods did not make these two as a riddle to be solved by elders. They made them as an answer. Stop trying to ask a different question. The priests brought this to the council. Ogwefi Eze was unimpressed. He had seen oracles before. He had seen people attribute natural weather patterns to supernatural causes before. He was a practical man, and he said so. On the fifth day, the Iroko tree in the palace courtyard, the one that had stood for longer than anyone could remember, the one that had survived every storm and every dry season and every war that had come near the palace walls, dropped every single one of its leaves, and not gradually. In one morning, between the first prayers and the second, every leaf fell. The tree stood bare in the dry season, which was not possible, which had never happened, which the oldest groundskeeper said in a shaking voice he had never seen in 60 years of tending this courtyard. The council reconvened, urgently, quietly, with the particular chastened energy of powerful men who have been told something by a force they cannot argue with. The twins had already left, not because they had heard of the signs, though they had, but because in the night, between the fourth and fifth day, they had both woken from their shared dream, sat up in the darkness, looked at each other, and understood, without speaking, that there was somewhere they needed to go. They slipped out of the palace in the hour before dawn. They were wearing plain wrappers and carrying nothing, moving through the gates with the ease of young women who had spent their whole lives in this palace and knew every shadow of it. They walked for 3 hours, through the red earth paths that led out of the city, through the farmland, into the edge of the great forest, the Agumure, the forest of spirits, where no one went casually and everyone went carefully. The trees here were older than the kingdom. Their roots broke the surface of the ground like the knuckles of buried giants. At the center of the forest was the shrine of Ikenga Abuo, the double strength, the two that are one. An ancient stone structure, low to the ground, carved with figures that appeared to be twins in every posture, sitting, standing, dancing, sleeping, always together, always touching. Neither princess had been brought here before. Neither had been told precisely where it was, yet they found it without hesitation, the way a river finds the sea, not by searching, but by following the nature of its own current. They knelt before the shrine together. The forest was completely silent, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of something paying attention. And then, in the way that truths sometimes arrive, not as a voice, not as a vision, but as a knowing that enters the body like warmth enters cold hands. They understood. They were not two people who loved each other unusually. They were one soul that the gods, for reasons of their own, had chosen to send into the world in two bodies. The bond that the palace physicians could not explain, that the council elders called indulgence, that neighboring kingdoms called strange, it was not a condition. It was not a bond formed after birth by closeness and affection. It was the original state. Everything else, every attempt to make them separate, every demand that they function as individuals, had been asking the sun to shine without light. Possible, perhaps, to imagine. Impossible to achieve without destroying what the sun actually was. No, the kingdom of Adumare was not sustained by the wealth of its farms, or the wisdom of its council, or the strength of its walls. It was sustained by this, by the presence within it of something the gods had placed here on purpose, a living proof, a testimony written in two human bodies of what it meant to be wholly, completely, and without reservation devoted to another. When they returned to the palace the following morning, walking back through the forest as dawn broke, arriving at the palace gates as the first fires were being lit in the courtyards, they were unchanged in appearance and entirely transformed in something that could not be seen. Urena walked the way Urena had always walked. Urema walked beside her as she always had. Their arms were linked, their breathing matched. But the palace felt it. The guards felt it. The women at their cooking fires looked up and felt something settle, like a house that has been slightly off its foundation, returning to true. And as they walked through the palace gates, clouds that had hung over Adumare for 5 days opened. It rained. The council did not argue. Ogbuefi Eze, who had spent 50 years being certain about things, sat in the council hall and looked at the rain falling outside and found for the first time in his life that he was uncertain, not weakened, not defeated, simply revised. A man who has been shown something he did not account for and is honest enough to admit it. "How does this work?" he asked the oracle Mama Chidinma, who had come to the council unbidden and taken a seat without asking permission. "2 queens. Has it been done?" "Not in Adumare," Mama Chidinma said, "but the gods do not limit themselves to what has been done before. If they did, nothing new would ever exist." The council wrote new law. It was careful and thorough and took many days because laws that break with tradition require more precision than laws that follow it. Every detail of joint rule had to be considered. How decisions would be made, how disputes within the council would be resolved, how they would be addressed in the courts of other kingdoms, what would happen in the event of marriage, of illness, of death. But underneath all the careful language and precise clauses, the law was simple. The throne of Adumare belongs to both. What the gods have joined, no human law shall divide. The coronation was held at the end of the rainy season, when the land was green and full, and the river ran deep and fast. The entire kingdom came. People walked for days from distant villages to stand in the great square of Adumare and watch. The twin queens did not walk to the throne separately and meet there. They walked together from the moment they left the palace doors, moving through the crowd with their arms linked and their steps matched. 2 bodies, 1 motion, 1 purpose. The crown was singular, because Adumare's crown had always been 1 crown. But the palace goldsmiths had worked for 3 months to recreate it. They made it larger, broader, a crown that rested on 2 heads, designed for no other heads in all the world. When it was placed on them, Urena and Urema turned and looked at each other. Whatever passed between them in that look was never spoken. It did not need to be. It was the look of people who have been themselves, and completely and without apology, and have been accepted, who have been asked to be less and refused, who have waited without knowing they were waiting for the world to finally make room for what they actually were. The crowd that watched them, traders and farmers and palace guards and visiting dignitaries, elders who had argued for tradition and priests who had always known better. The crowd was silent for a moment that stretched and stretched. Then someone began to weep. Then someone else. Then the sound moved through the crowd, the way water moves through dry earth. Everywhere at once, unstoppable. They were not weeping for sadness. They were weeping the way people weep when they see something true, when they see something that reaches inside them and touches the part of themselves that still believes in the things they were told as children. That love is real, that the gods pay attention, that some bonds cannot be broken by any force in the world, no matter how powerful, no matter how long it tries. The rain that had broken the drought was still in the earth. The Iroko tree in the palace courtyard had put out new leaves within 3 days of the twins' return. The river ran full. Queen Urena and Queen Urema sat on the throne of Adumare together, and the kingdom, which had always been beautiful, which had always been rich in the ways that matter, became, from that day, legendary. If this story is touching your heart, please hit the subscribe button and join our storytelling family here on Talesbyoma, because more powerful stories are coming. Generations later, in the kingdom of Adumare, mothers tell this story to their children at night. They tell it the way all great stories are told, not to teach a lesson, because the greatest stories are too large for lessons, but because some truths need to be heard again and again, so that they do not forget themselves. They say, there were 2 queens who were one soul. They say, the gods do not make mistakes, and what they joined, no elder could divide. They say, the land itself bore witness, and the sky, and the ancient tree in the palace courtyard, and the river that feeds the western farms. They say, if you want to understand what love is, not the love of courtship or convenience or comfort, but love in its original form, now love as the gods intended it before the world decided to complicate it, you need only look at the story of Urena and Urema, 2 stars, always side by side, never dimming. The children listen, and somewhere in them, something old and true and stubborn recognizes the story. The way a person recognizes a song they have never heard but somehow, impossibly, already know. Nki abu omumu ha. This is how they were born, bounded in the womb, bounded in the world, bounded forever.